was part of the ceremony celebrating the launch of the Regional Spotlight Initiative. It was a difficult time for UN Women, as we had just lost our representative, Alison Anderson McLean, who had done a lot to make sure this became a reality. But it was in celebration of the fact that in 2017, the European Union and the United Nations jointly launched the Spotlight Initiative. It was the first initiative of its kind in terms of investment in ending violence against women and girls. Now, there are many challenges to sustainable development, clearly. But violence against women and girls has always been considered a secondary issue, one we will get to after we get the roads done, after we get the crime under control. Interesting, since violence against women and girls, at least now, is a crime. And after we deal with climate change and disaster risk resilience. The Spotlight Initiative focused on 6 main pillars. The first was on policy and legislation, the second, strengthening institutions, the third, on social norms and prevention, the fourth, on services, the fifth, on data and statistics, and the sixth, on the women's movement. Now, the partnership was demonstrative of multilateralism at its best. Sustainable Development Goal 17 at work, all of us recognizing that we have something to give to solve a global issue. And I think right now, even more than ever, we see the importance of multilateralism. This program was developed with clarity on the principle of upholding human dignity. And the Secretary General recently, on his speech on women, peace and security, noted that still far too many perpetrators of sexual violence walk free. Both perpetrators of violence online and offline. Noted that we have a massive barrier for women entering participation in civic and political life, which is interesting in the Caribbean when we have so many. Well, we don't have so many, but we have at least one head of government who's a woman, and we have many heads of state that are women. But if we are now in a position where we have the data to know that at least if we take the countries that we have prevalence data for, it's only 5 in the Caribbean, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada, Guyana, and Jamaica, the first mover on this, that 46% of women who have ever been in a relationship have experienced some form of violence from their partner. That means at least 1 in 2 women have been dealing with this in their life. That's why the Spotlight Initiative in the Caribbean has been focused specifically in a way to measure success. This particular activity is one of the ways in which we said we would have a signature intervention with parliamentarians, civil society, private sector, an intergenerational dialogue, ensuring that no one is left behind. It sounds great, but how do we make sure that we have initiatives where persons who are living with disabilities can fully engage? To make sure that we come together to establish a strategy for how we will move forward. Within the context of the small island developing states environment, how do we ensure that we center it on the human being, whether the human being is a female or a male in the Caribbean? Now, we have many measurements for what success is supposed to look like in terms of sustainable development, and we can look to the Sustainable Development Goals. But even before the Sustainable Development Goals, we could look at the Beijing Platform for Action. Some of you were there in 1995 in Beijing. I am sure you, like I, am quite shocked. We are 30 years in 2025. 2 more years, we'll be celebrating 30 years of Beijing, a platform for action as to how we can achieve gender equality. How have each of our countries delivered? The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which every single Caribbean country and territory has ratified or signed on to. How are we measuring our success when we report? I know Jamaica, for example, is reporting this year. Some people are going to be reporting next year. The Bahamas, who unfortunately are not here with us, will be also reporting next year. Some countries have never reported. Oh, you are here, how are you? We heard you weren't coming. It's fantastic to have you. Fantastic to have you. And they have the SDG indicators, clearly measured by the proportion of women who have experienced violence in their life. Only 5 countries in the Caribbean can measure that, whether we have made success. So what are the decision makers going to do about how we decide to allocate funding for programming so that we can measure success, but also how we can ensure that programs are in place to measure the proportion of seats held by women in national parliaments? Because that also is a measure of success as to whether we have achieved sustainable development. The country with laws and regulation that guarantee the full and equal access to women and men aged 15 years and older to sexual and reproductive health care. That is a measure of success. The SDGs clearly tell us, and this is not some Western institution being imported and applied in the region. Every one of our countries, I have been to the General Assembly, and I am always proud because our countries are making their voices heard when we determine what success looks like. The Secretary General has indicated that the current rate of progress is not sufficient for us to actually be successful with gender equality. In fact, it will be another half a century before women are fairly represented in national parliaments. And before I go any further, between the 3 years as to when Spotlight began and where we are now, we lost a lot of stalwarts, including Alex Boyd Knights, the former Speaker of the Dominican Parliament. She was the longest serving Speaker in Dominica's history. For 20 years, she served as designated Speaker Emerita. And I remember the last time I saw her was after Hurricane Maria. And she was in Trinidad and Tobago, and not Trinidad and Tobago, she was in Barbados. And she was speaking about resilience. And she felt that it was an affront to speak about it after the event. She said, right now we are traumatized. And she spoke in jest about the shoes, her beautiful shoes that were all lost. And if we wanted to speak about resilience, we should be speaking about resilience before its preparation as well as compassion. And it led me to think more about resilience as a space where violence is not relied upon to address problems, because compassion lives where we have resilience. It is a place where people are empowered and educated. They trust state institutions because the state institutions have demonstrated that they are principled and aligned to the international standards to which they themselves have contributed to developing. Resilience lies in not just equality, but fairness. You hear a lot of people speaking about they don't feel that the justice they are seeking has been served because it was unfair. And if we look at all of the elements of resilience, then resilience must lie in gender equality. It must. So this meeting, we want to hear from you. Why are you here today? I hope it's because you too believe gender equality is part of a resilient future for the Caribbean and our sustainable development. I hope that we can all not only draw lessons from the Spotlight Initiative, where there have been so many gains, whether it be in Guyana, where they have been using cottage industries to empower women to leave violent relationships, or the fact that Jamaica now knows how much violence actually costs the country, 6.49% of the GDP, which is around $1 billion US. Whether it is in social accountability frameworks or the fact that the Caribbean women's movement, with which a Caribbean feminist and Daya used to say doesn't exist, has been working through difficult conversations to create umbrella organizations to support one another. In this moment of extreme vulnerability, we need each other more than ever, and we need to prioritize the people in social development. We speak about people, planet, prosperity, and peace often. how can we make sure we don't forget that people are at the center of all of those when we talk about the 2030 agenda? On behalf of all of my colleagues, I want to take this opportunity to reiterate the United Nations commitment to enrich partnerships to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, including gender equality. And I want to thank the European Union for being a consistent partner. I want to thank Parl-Americas for being a consistent partner. Eilish and Alicia Todd, from the time Parl-Americas came on the scene, our first collaboration was in St. Lucia. So we're excited to continue our collaboration in St. Lucia. And that was a conversation on bringing men and boys into ending violence against women and girls. I want to thank my incredible team, Letitia Nicholas, Rachel Boma. We have Rachel from Tanzania supporting the Spotlight Initiative, Isabel Ould, who is a UN volunteer from Ireland, and Lisa Legault-Belgrave. Without their support, and Patricia Blem, who is an intern at UN Women from Vienna. She could not travel because our insurance don't allow the interns to travel, and she's very upset about it, as she should be. But I just want to thank all of them. And I also want to thank you, Speaker George. Without having male allies, this work is not possible. So thank you. Thank you all. We look forward to a really exciting 2 days.
Some may not know Parl-Americas, so I do have to do my due diligence and explain that we are the parliamentary organization that convenes all of the parliaments from across the Americas and the Caribbean. Originally created out of a resolution from the Organization of American States to create a hemispheric vehicle for parliaments to engage in political discourse, parliamentary diplomacy, sharing of experiences and good practices. And that's what we've been doing now for the past 22 years. But I will say, I think, as Tani mentioned, where we really kind of got our feet under ourselves here in the Caribbean was in St. Lucia. I think it was in 2015. We did a meeting here in St. Lucia on such an incredibly important topic, which was around eliminating violence against women. And so I guess in some ways I'm a little sad to say that we're still here talking about eliminating violence against women, but I know that we are here working together because we have that goal in mind among many other goals. This meeting, so Parl-Americas right now, we prioritize 3 priority pillars, let's say. That's how we organize ourselves. Gender equality, climate change and sustainable development, and then what we call open parliament, which is really strengthening parliaments to be more open, transparent, accountable, engaging of citizens in their work. This meeting, I'd say, would culminate, brings 2 of those major themes together here, certainly, well, all of them, because good, transparent parliaments are needed to undertake this work, and we continue to work on that. But here we're talking really about sustainable development and gender equality, and how truly interconnected these things are. One will not be achieved without the other, right? We do truly need gender equality to achieve proper sustainable development in the Caribbean and throughout the world. And I guess I'm just mindful right now, I don't know if you agree with me, it feels like the world's on fire, almost, right? Literally in Canada, it really was on fire, okay, this summer. But figuratively, even here, we have these increased climate events, which I know you are all far more conscious of than I guess even we are in Canada, I would say, except for this past summer really kind of brought it to light in our minds. But also it's just like there's political discord and this polarization in our world, and it's affecting all of us. And sometimes it feels overwhelming, and at the same time I feel like it gives me this spirit to like, we have to redouble our efforts. We really have to redouble our efforts to work towards transformative change in all of our societies, to make sure that we're really working for the citizens that elect our parliaments, our governments. We all have the same goals in this world, right? We want a place of safety and security for our citizens. We all want our kids to have, good education, good medical resources. We want the same things. We just want to live. And we know that most citizens, that's what they do. They elect their governments, their parliaments, to take care of that, right? And they're like, I just want a good life. I put you there. And we're saying, no, you need to be working with us too. We need citizen participation. We need civil society involved in that conversation. We need the public sector, the private sector involved in those conversations. This is all very important work that we're doing. And the one thing I love about the Caribbean, I've learned, you have these beautiful sayings. I'm pretty sure many hands make light work, but it's true. we all need to work together. And so I think this idea that we've been doing a series of these meetings, this one really is promoting Spotlight, but even prior to Spotlight, these series of these meetings that are multi-stakeholder engagements that we've been partnering with UN Women on to bring together, civil society, the national gender machineries, government, parliamentarians have had success, will continue to have success. We are here to work together. No, Parliamericas is your partner in that. We will continue to work with the parliaments across the Caribbean to take the, what comes out of these meetings, to come up with more tools and resources and supports at the national level to see if we can drive forward on transformative change, on solutions, on progress. And so again, I'm always humbled, very humbled and honored to be in a room with so many wonderful people who I know share my vision share our collective vision for a better Caribbean, a better world. And so thank you for being here, because this doesn't work unless you come to the meetings. And so really, you're the ones doing the real work. But thank you, UN Women, for your amazing collaboration as always, and your wonderful team. Thank you to my team who really do all the heavy lifting. Eilish and Chrisette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for agreeing to have us come back to St. Lucia for this meeting. I'm very grateful, and Madam President, for agreeing to have us here in St. Lucia as well, and to your capable team who have been very supportive in putting together this meeting as well at the Parliament. So for Parliamericas, we're so grateful for the member parliaments. They really do all the work. They're very supportive of us. So thank you for being here. I'm here to listen, to learn, to take home my homework, and to see how we can be supportive hereafter from Parliamericas to bring forward this change. Thank you.
And civil society. On behalf of the House of Assembly of St. Lucia, I extend greetings and welcome this opportunity to host this meeting. In fact, it was in Vancouver. Alicia just raised this idea, and I thought, why not? And thanks to my parliamentary staff, in a very short time, less than 6 weeks, we are here. So can I get a round of applause for my staff? I also bring greetings on behalf of the Board of Directors of Parliamericas, and I'm extremely pleased to have many of my colleagues here today. Let's be clear about this. I support gender equality. But I do not believe legislation is the way forward. You could have all the legislation and don't have sensitive men in office, you're going to get nowhere. In St. Lucia, 5 of our 6 senators, government senators, are female. In the overall Senate, 6 of the 11 are female. And at this point, I want to recognize a very special individual. She is currently our parliamentary commissioner, but she became the first female and the first person in the entire OECS to head both houses of parliament. Please welcome Rosemary Matthew. Gender equality is not just a moral imperative. It is a social and economic necessity. Empowering women and ensuring the full participation in all aspects of society is fundamental to achieving sustainable development. When we speak of sustainable development, we mean a future where economic growth, social well-being, and environmental protection are all in balance. Gender equality is one of the cornerstones of this vision. Multi-stakeholder dialogue refers to the active participation of various actors, including governments, civil society, the private sector, and the international community in discussions and actions related to gender equality and sustainable development. This approach recognizes that no single entity can address these complex issues alone, and that collaboration is essential. Let me highlight a few key reasons why multi-stakeholder dialogue is vital. Diverse perspectives. When multiple stakeholders come together, they bring a wide range of perspectives and experiences to the table. This diversity of thought can lead to more comprehensive and effective solutions. For example, the private sector can offer innovative business models that benefit from gender equality, while civil society can bring grassroots knowledge and community needs. Holistic solutions. Gender equality and sustainable development are interlinked. They can't be addressed in isolation. Multi-stakeholder dialogue allows for the development of holistic solutions that consider the complex and interconnected nature of these challenges. It's not just about achieving gender equality. It's also about ensuring that development is environmentally sustainable and socially inclusive. Resource mobilization. Achieving gender equality and sustainable development requires significant resources. Governments, the private sector, the international organizations must pool their resources and expertise. Dialogue helps identify opportunities for financial investment and collaboration, ensuring that resources are allocated efficiently. Accountability and monitoring. Multi-stakeholder dialogue can establish accountability mechanisms to track progress toward gender equality and sustainable development. Regular reporting and evaluation can help ensure that commitments are met and that actions are aligned with goals. Policy formulation. Policy making is often more effective when it involves input from multiple stakeholders. By consulting the various actors, governments can develop policies that are more likely to succeed and be widely accepted. This collaborative approach can lead to policy changes that address gender disparities and promote sustainability. Perhaps our Minister for Gender will address that, but I can steal some of her thunder by telling you, for 25 years, we in St. Lucia have been trying to draft a Domestic Violence Act, 25 years. And in her first year in office, we passed the most progressive Domestic Violence Act in the Commonwealth. Not just St. Lucia, in the Commonwealth, whereby a neighbor who sees domestic violence taking place can make a report to the police. It doesn't have to be somebody involved in the relationship. And we also have penalties if the female decides to drop the charge. But that's for another show. In conclusion, multi-stakeholder dialogue is a critical tool for advancing gender equality and sustainable development. It brings together diverse perspectives, fosters holistic solutions, mobilizes resources, ensures accountability, and informs policy formulation. As we work towards a more equitable and sustainable future, it is imperative that we continue to engage in these dialogues and commit to concrete actions that will transform our world for the better. Before I say thank you, I want to especially welcome the delegation from my second homeland, Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you for your attention. Together we can make gender equality and sustainable development a reality for all. Thank you.
Welcome to every one of you who will be embarking on this meaningful exchange of information over the coming days. As we gather as a Women Parliamentary Caucus, you may find it interesting to know that St. Lucia is the only country in the world that is named after a woman. So we are thrilled to host all of you on our shores. We in St. Lucia culminate in Creole Heritage Month celebrations, and I hope you are lucky enough to just get a small bit of what this entailed, and maybe it can entice you to come back next year with your family to enjoy the whole package in the month of October. That's a little plug in there for the Ministry of Tourism. Our agenda for the next 2 days is critical to our continued national and regional development. We know about the great costs of gender inequality and violence against women and girls to every aspect of society and populations. And we also know of the difficult challenge we have faced and continue to face in eradicating the deep roots of these issues. For this reason, it is imperative that we keep these issues at the fore in all spaces, actively drawing attention to inequalities and all the ways they manifest. Even where it may not be immediately evident, there is no sustainable development issues that are not also gender equality issues. We must also ensure that we are continuing to learn about the lived experiences and needs of the diverse members of our populations and are being responsive, innovative, and collaborative in our action. I wish to take this opportunity to share some of the work that the government of St. Lucia has been doing to promote gender equality by closing the inequality gap through the implementation of the following programs that empower women and provide for sustainable livelihoods. 1, the Youth Economy Law provided for the development of a youth economy agency where persons under the age of 35 years can acquire support in the areas of marketing, mentorship, and finance to transform their skills or talents into business. One of the pillars of the youth economy is to increase support to agricultural initiatives which builds on our food security. 2, the Micro, Small, and Medium-Sized Enterprise Program under the Minister for Commerce. It caters to persons who do not necessarily fall within the under 35 gap, where support is given in the form of a 30% loan and 70% grant to give our people a boost with developing their businesses. The majority of applicants to either of these programs are women. These 2 initiatives increase in self-sufficiency. Speaking of food security and women, our government over the last few months has provided support to 2 women-only non-profit organizations, Helen's Daughters and Raise Your Voice St. Lucia, by leasing land at less than $100 an acre for the establishment of agro-processing plants and farm fields. As I mentioned before, sustainable development cannot be achieved if gender inequality is not addressed. Our government has now mainstreamed gender inequality, especially with budget initiatives to ensure a gender lens is applied. With the passage of the Domestic Violence Act, there is a zero tolerance for violence against women and girls, and our Parliament continues its advocacy to educate the public on this. And just recently, the youth parliamentarians debated it at both levels, at the House level and Senate levels. There is still much to do in terms of giving recognition and value to unpaid care and domestic work where the care economy is concerned. As a start, the government is working swiftly towards implementation of a livable wage, which will be the starting point for measuring the hard work of our women. I look forward to the opportunity this meeting provides to exchange with you all and strengthen our collective knowledge about how we can best contribute collectively to achieving a sustainable, equitable, and violence-free Caribbean. I'm also very excited about Day 3 and the opportunity to engage in greater exchange among the representatives of women parliamentary caucuses. I have had one-on-one conversations with Speaker Woods and Madam President Sandiford of Belize, President Alicia Williams Grant Antigua, they are here this morning, Madam Speaker of Grenada, Madam President of Grenada, about their caucus experience, and I look forward to greater discussions to explore areas of interest, good practices, and developing proposals that will thereafter present to seek further technical assistance from our partners, Pan-Americans, UN Women. I thank the organizers for allowing us, the Parliament, to invite two observers, and we have one here in the person of Dr. Rosemary Husband-Smatre and Legal Officer Tessa Mangal, who will be joining us later. They have been very supportive of the Parliament in helping us push the agenda for the caucus, and also Leon Theodore in her absence. So I thank you very much, organizers, for allowing us to bring them in as observers, and they will participate, trust me. I want to thank also the Parliament staff of the Parliament of St. Lucia, who've been hardworking through it all. Let's give them another round of applause. And the men, the brothers who are seated here in the room, I want to acknowledge them. I want you to give them a round of applause. They are here with us, and I look forward to hearing from our gentlemen. I extend appreciation to the Government of Canada through Global Affairs Canada, the EU-UN Spotlight Initiative, UN Women Caribbean, Pan-Americas, and our dedicated team at Parliament of St. Lucia again, as well as all present, for contributing to making this meeting the success I know it will be. I thank you. Merci. Gracias. Good morning.
I want to say that the Small Island Development States Agenda is an important one and includes strategies that enable states to address what I call structural vulnerabilities. Many of these structural vulnerabilities flow from our historical origins of racist violence and unequal exchange and extraction that highly advantaged Europe. We also have more contemporary crises and issues, some of which are consequential of this unequal global political economy that continues to bedevil us, and that includes indebtedness, as well as the climate and environmental degradation connected to overproduction and overconsumption, capitalistic overproduction and overconsumption. Much of the SIDS agenda, I think, or a good part of it, is related to SDG 10, Sustainable Development Goal 10, which is addressing inequalities between states. So we are calling for fair and reparative terms of access to finance, which is a real core call of SIDS agenda and of CARICOM member states. And that fair access to finance will give, that's the theory, will give states some fiscal space to build out social development, strengthen access to healthcare, education, and of course, social protection, and may allow the state to create an enabling environment to invest in technology to drive enterprise and increase the levels of decent work and decent employment. I use the word may that finances may give fiscal space. Because as we all know, there are also deep governance issues that intercede between finance and development. And those issues include corruption, the diversion of income for the benefit of a few, inadequate or absent planning, wasteful implementation of programs, hyperpartisanship, a real big issue in small island states in the Caribbean, and hyperpartisanship and political polarization to same some, I think, governance issues that we're struggling with. So finance can solve some problems, and yes, I would say, but yes, it can also exacerbate others. It may seem to you that I'm straying from the topic assigned to me, and I should actually have put on my timing clock so I keep on track. But maybe I'm not, maybe I am. What I do think is that unless we address inequalities, not only between states, but within states in the Caribbean and our governance issues, we will continue to suffer social fragmentation, disillusionment, and lose any sense of common cause that keeps societies together and strong. What do we know? One, that inequalities in the Caribbean are still quite profound, with poverty rates exceeding maybe over 25% in most countries. And this worsened because of the COVID shutdowns. UN Women did a number of studies and also used some IADB studies, which found on average for 6 countries that 58% of poor households lost income. 58% on average of those 6 countries lost income, poor households lost income, as opposed to 45% for middle-income households and 26% of high-income households. Income losses was also connected to labor market structures. Households with low incomes were more vulnerable to employment loss than high-income households, and women, no surprise here, were also more vulnerable to income and job losses than men, and of course women carry the burden of care in the main in the Caribbean for children, the sick, and the elderly. So you can see what the multiplier effects are when they lose income and they lose jobs. Those who are already living on the margins will push further into poverty. So this persistent poverty, this social inequality, is one of the causes of the social dysfunctions that we're experiencing, increasing violent crime, insecurity, social fragmentation, for example. Now, speaking specifically to gender inequality, and, I think other panelists, maybe Tony will speak about inequality in the labor market, for example, inequality in access to social protection and so on. What we also know to be true is that there's no human rights violation more tolerated than violence that women and girls experience across their diversities and in different contexts. And because of this, no human rights violation is more pervasive, I'm suggesting, more universal and more damaging to societies, communities, and families. Violence against women is a weapon of power and control, used in times of peace as well as in times of conflict, and we hear in the news every day about that. It is both a cause of sex and gender discrimination and a tool with which such discrimination is perpetuated, reinforced, strengthened. Of course, we keep resisting, and meetings like this are part of the resistance. And I would say quite a successful resistance, but we are facing pushback, which I'm sure we can talk about in the discussion. So gender-based violence, I want to say, is the most pervasive form of violence in the Caribbean. If you will think of all types of violence, gender-based violence is the most pervasive. And despite the great efforts of women's movement, including those supported by the Spotlight Initiative, so much of that violence goes unreported and unpunished. I'm telling you all things you know well. And so we're still confronting some invisibilization and normalization of violence that arguably has the most impact on society, if only because those who live in violent contexts are also socialized by that violence. It shapes their expectations and it can determine the trajectory of their lives and therefore the kind of body politic or cultural politic of the country. So to get back to a gender setting and where gender equality and inequalities fit in a gender setting, I think we all observed the CARICOM meeting on crime and violence as a public health issue. It was a title that I wondered at that title a lot. I still wonder at it. Because my view is that crime and violence is a social justice issue. It's an issue of inequalities in the sense of caused by inequalities, caused by lack of opportunities to decent and affirming education and employment. These are factors that create that growing gap through which drugs and weaponization are entering our region. Yet, when we look at the declaration that came out of that meeting, many of the recommendations address what is perceived to be problems of the criminal justice system. And yes, there are problems in the criminal justice system. But little is said, I think, in a direct way about social justice. Though there is a call for reform of our education systems, but if you look at the call for that reform, the call is to empower our citizens and better enable their socio-emotional development. But we know that the education system is failing so many. So before they even get out into the work market, many have perceived themselves to be failures because they don't pass all that succession of tests that we keep giving children in the Caribbean. In that declaration, there's also some vague, depoliticized language around promoting public awareness and education campaigns that challenge harmful beliefs, very important, and even bigger language about, quote unquote, addressing domestic violence. But I think that's more or less it about gender-based violence in that declaration. Does this approach really respond adequately and in a proportionate way to what we know about gender-based violence, its dimensions, its consequences? I think that's a question that we can have a discussion around today. And so the question that is posed, how do I reconcile social development issues such as gender equality and ending violence against women and girls and the priorities set out by Caribbean SIDS? I would say simply, we must hold states and ourselves to account for public policies that incorporate evidence about the causes and consequences of gender inequality and gender-based violence and offer whole of society solutions. In other words, we need political will. And I love this definition of political will, and I encourage you to take it down and repeat it. Political will is having the capacity and the intention to end gender inequality and gender-based violence and to fulfill human rights for life, personal integrity, and equal protection of the law. Political will is not just having the rhetoric. It's having the rhetoric, the intention, and the capacity to achieve this result. So I stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. A takeaway for me there is that, one, you cannot talk about the economic priorities of any one of our countries without addressing the inequalities, both within our individual countries and between our individual countries as well. And then, of course, the definition of political will. It's the first time I've heard it described as such, but absolutely on point. It is not about the rhetoric, but it's about the capacity and intention to end domestic violence. So it's action and not just words. Let me move now to Dr. Virginia Albert-Poyet, and the question, of course, coming from St. Lucia, directed to you, is if you can share St. Lucia's experience addressing violence against women and girls, and how do you see the work being part of the broader SIDS agenda?
The journey on gender equality, not just in St. Lucia, but in the region, I think it's about 30 years. I have been out there in the wilderness. And basically, I think St. Lucia has benefited from that and the wider Caribbean. And it was in 1993 we started the issue of gender equality among educators. And while we speak here, it is important that we target educators if we want to make a difference in the next generation. And in 1995, I was part of the team that led the Beijing Platform for Action. And as Tony indicated, in the next 2 years, it will be 30 years. And we are still talking about gender equality. But I don't think it's only talk. I think we are seeing results. It might not be at the rate that we want, but there has been a great transformation. For those of you who were not there 30 years ago, we have seen a big difference. And in the case of St. Lucia, I can share with the audience here that I feel a special energy with regards to the issues of gender throughout the country, among all sectors, NGOs, and civil society organizations. And I can share with you that I also see that energy among my cabinet colleagues. No apologies, but we have only 2 elected women in the cabinet. We are surrounded by men, but we hold the fort. We hold the fort for women. And with that, we are seeing that the gender machinery now is coming on, ready to take on the challenge. I know it is a big challenge for them. But what really sparked the energy was when we got this domestic violence bill, which became an act on International Women's Day. And we felt that it was a gift because most women, they are the bigger victim of gender inequality and violence, and the girls. And we felt the government had actually put in legislation to give support to that agenda. But legislation is not the only thing. You need action. And so far, we are seeing that we are translating this legislation into action. Your presence here is also adding to the energy that we want in St. Lucia to achieve gender equality. And gender equality, as we indicate, it is one that we will not attain sustainable development if we do not include gender in the discussion. If we do not have men and women equally contributing to national development, we will not achieve sustainable development. And sustainable development basically means we have to sustain what is good for the country, what is good for the planet, what is good for men, women, and children. And with that, I am hoping that the discussion that we have today and tomorrow, that it will translate into a bigger momentum within the region. And many times we have people who occupy positions of decision-making. But these persons, it's not any fault of theirs, but they are not gender sensitive. And because they are not gender sensitive, you find that they just skirt or talk about the issues and do not take action. And we must not make the mistake of believing that it's only women who are gender sensitive. We have made a fundamental error over the decades in believing that to achieve gender equality, we must speak to women, and we exclude the men. We have to go back to the drawing board and bring them on board. When we talk about violence against women, who are the perpetrators? Men. Are we talking to them? And because of economic inequality, you find that women who depend on men, many times they suffer in silence because they are depending on their partners. And I may be a target because my strategy is to empower women, help them develop their skills so they can have economic independence, they can take care of themselves, and if they are not happy in a relationship, they can choose to walk out of the relationship. And they don't have to stay there to suffer the abuse from the partner because they are dependent on the partners. We have the children who witness violence against women and domestic violence. And these children have to go into school. They have to live the rest of their lives remembering this experience. And all these will affect sustainable development, it will affect national development, and it will be a huge cost to governments, civil society, and non-governmental organizations. So I want to encourage you. I know it's not a wise idea to give a politician a microphone, but I must say that if we continue along the path, if we continue along the route that we are taking, and we bring all partners together, it cannot be done by one. And I heard Roberta Clark mention earlier about the political will. And this is one thing I have tried my best, and I make no apologies for this. I have secured the political will of my Prime Minister and my cabinet of ministers to push the gender agenda.
Thank you, Dr. Poyet. Now you can appreciate how her words resonated so well after a year and a half with me. But let me just, before we move on to our next panel, so 30 years since the Beijing Plan of Action, and we're still here talking about domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And Dr. Poyet referred to, however, that let's not be discouraged. There has been some transformation since 30 years. And if I can give a plug for CIWL representatives who certainly, I think, do a phenomenal job on transformational leadership, but underscoring, as Dr. Poyet was saying earlier, it's not just about women. Men and women being feminists, fighting for social justice, fighting against inequality. What stood out, two things for me, is holding the fort. When women and men are at the table, we have to hold our leaders to account. And we have to be very frank and honest that not everybody that gets to the table are gender sensitive. And so it becomes even more critical that we hold them to account. And the other thing is the statement that Dr. Poyet made about your presence here and the energy that she feels in the room as we got on the way. I can certainly say to you as a Caribbean woman, I don't know any other region where you can put men and women together and the energy isn't as high and enthusiastic and on fire as the Caribbean. And I make no apologies for that. So I appreciate what she says in every session that I've been at, especially in the Caribbean. The discussion on gender violence is a real one. It's not rhetoric, it's not academia, it's about real experiences on the ground and persons in our community that we're coming in contact with, that we're bringing to the forefront, that makes that energy even more electric and alive. So thank you for that. I do want to ask you, since as a politician you did give me a few extra minutes on the additional minutes that we got from Roberta, if you can briefly tell us, because you spoke of the domestic violence bill in St. Lucia, what specific strategy did you employ to get it on the parliamentary agenda where there's only 2 women in that cabinet?
Okay, now I knew that bill was in the making for some time. NGOs, the division of the Department of Gender Affairs, and a number of civil society organizations were dotting the I's, crossing the T's every time they send it back for correction. And I recall having a discussion with the Prime Minister. And he told me, Minister, are you ready? I said, I am ready. And I said, I want it on International Women's Day. And we went into cabinet, we had the bill, I had studied the bill with gender, we had discussed it, I knew everything that was in it, and then we approved in cabinet that this bill goes to Parliament on International Women's Day. And so we went into Parliament. This is the first time we had ever seen the chambers of Parliament full. We had people outside, they had tents and they were serving drinks and food. And I actually got the Parliament ministers, including the Prime Minister, to leave the chambers of Parliament, and we went outside. And I had the bill in my hand waving, and I say, we're going to pass it today. So that was the kind of drama that went around the bill. And this particular bill dominated the media for 3 consecutive weeks in St. Lucia. And no item lasts, no media item would last for 3 weeks in St. Lucia. It could be murder, it could be this, it could be anything. That will not last. Another story will come up. But they could not put that item off. And it hit the region. And soon after, about a week after, I went to the UN for the CSW at the UN, and I raised it again, and it actually captured regional and international attention. I think one of the issues in that bill that really captured people's interest was one where it spoke to, regardless of orientation, when you are protected from domestic violence. It does not matter whatever your sexual orientation. It also speaks about domestic violence where the women attack their male partners, so the men like that. They bought into it because they thought the violence was just about women. They realized they are also covered, and we ask the women not to harass the partners. Don't keep calling them and asking them, where are you, and on the phone and so on. That's a form of harassment, and you could be charged for doing that. So that actually made it palatable. But the interesting thing is that 1 month after we enacted this legislation, I met some men who told me there was some incident of domestic violence, and they asked me why we still have domestic violence when we pass the legislation. So I told them, no, it will take a little while. We have to change behavior, we have to change attitude, and a number of things before we can see a disappearance of domestic violence. Okay.
Thank you. Concise, clear target date, and keeping it real with the content. Commissioner Clark, we are now going to ask you if you could share your thoughts on just a few of the key steps that Caribbean countries should take to effectively address the elimination of violence against women, highlighting, if you will, some of the better practices that you are aware of and that can positively benefit other areas of national development.
Thank you, Speaker Witz, for that consideration. I can be here until 1:45, and I'm going to keep to my 3 minutes so I don't take up the time from the 6 minutes. I come back from being in conformities, but maybe Tony can go first and I can go after her, because I can be here until another 15 minutes.
Certainly. Yeah. I am following directions, and so I will do that. So Tony, the question that we have for you in the first round, to wrap up the first round, is on the matter of citizen security. It is a priority issue for Caribbean SIDS. We now know with the statistics that the region has a homicide rate of 2.5 times the global average, with firearms used in majority of homicides. It's an interesting topic, actually, on our drive over from the airport to our hotel, if you can imagine that. When we asked about crime, this came up by the driver that brought us over. So, Tony, how can one prioritize gender equality and ending violence against women and girls within this context?
Commissioner Clark is the person who hired me to work at UNIFEM many years ago. And I have to say that CWIL also exists because in Belize, there was a meeting many years ago with CWIP. And when Commissioner Clark was the head of UNIFEM at the time, she partnered with the head of UNDP, who happened to be Dr. Wilshire, and they supported this meeting in Belize all those years ago. And I saw her write the transformational leadership program for CWIL that led to the trainings in which I first met President Reynolds as well at the time as minister. So I just want to say what she does is also intentional. It's the talk and the action. For crime, and I think what she said earlier resonates, it's that we have a conversation about crime in a very siloed way. But when you look at the perpetrators, they're usually young men, and it's a very gendered issue. When we look at our education system, and Dr. Poyot, being an educator herself, spoke that we need to get to the education system, as did Commissioner Clark. Where is the dignity for young people in this process? Where's the dignity if you did not pass for your first choice or your second choice? And where do you then choose to locate yourself to find dignity? If you look at our research with regards to violence against women and girls, and I had to write it down because when we were looking at the research come in, we started thinking, wow, these connections are not being made. Yes, violence is a public health issue, but if you're not looking at it as a social justice issue, you won't see that for most of the women in Guyana who have experienced violence in their relationships, and that's 55% of the women, their partners, 78% of their partners saw their mothers being abused. 69% of their partners were themselves abused in terms of physical violence, and 84% had already gotten in a fight with another man. If you look at Grenada, 63% had gotten in a fight with another man. If you look at Jamaica, 64% had gotten in a fight with another man. Suriname, 71% got in a fight with another man. And Trinidad and Tobago, 74%. So we're looking at people who choose violence as a means for conflict resolution. So if we want to address the violent crimes happening, one, we need to look at what is happening to our young people where they are choosing violence. If you're not addressing the violence in the homes, and that's violence perpetrated against children and violence perpetrated against women, we are not going to get to the root causes and solutions for the violence that we see in our communities. Another statistic that was very interesting, and St. Lucia was the first country in the Caribbean that we were able to do a pilot for the public assistance program. In many of our public assistance cash transfer programs, people notice most of the people are women and single women. What they didn't notice was that at least 80% of them were also violence survivors. And what we did was collaborate with the government to give a stipend to these women so that they could have health, they could have childcare, as well as their public assistance. As a result of that, the women were able to then graduate, train themselves in other ways. But it spoke to a larger issue around early childhood education and subsidized childcare. We don't have specific data for the Caribbean yet. But when we look at a 22-year study in the United States at early childhood education, what they saw was that children that were not in the program had a 5 times multiplier effect risk at being chronic lawbreakers. They also looked at the fact that another program that was a 15-year program, children who did not participate in that program was 70% more likely to be arrested for violent crime by the age of 18. So when we're doing our legislation and when we're looking at the issues affecting the region, like violent crime, like the homicide rates, when we're looking at the solutions, are we thinking about early childhood education? Are we thinking about support to mothers who are on public assistance programs? And are we thinking about comprehensive responses to violence in the home? Not usually. Not usually. So this is why gender equality, and it goes to the minister's remark that you spoke to, that all issues are women's issues, and all issues are gender equality issues, including this kind of violence we see manifested in our spaces.
Thank you, Tony. Now, you know, when Tony is in a session, we're going to get the staggering statistics that brings it home. Those were some scary statistics, but it kept it real. The fact is, as Tony mentioned, that if we don't address the why are our young people choosing violence? And if we took the time to look at the cycle of violence, that we're looking at survivors of violence, and it continues to perpetuate throughout. And so we cannot escape looking at the root cause and having the experience of those studies on the importance of subsidized childcare and early childhood education, something that I think Dr. Poyet and other ministers will agree in cabinet who are present. That's an actual intentional action that parliamentarians can take on. So thank you for that, Tony. We're going to quickly move into that second round and take advantage of Commissioner Clark's limited time with us, where we now are going to pivot and speak to some of the shared experiences or data that can perhaps help us in terms of strengthening the advocacy that we're looking for to end violence against women. So we are going to ask you, Commissioner Clark, if you can share with us some of the better practices which could also benefit other areas of development that our Caribbean countries could take to effectively address the elimination of violence against women.
Thank you very much. So I want to start quickly by saying I think one of the things that we have to keep on doing is ending the silence and protecting those who speak up, either victims and or human rights defenders who speak up on their behalf. The cost of domestic violence and all forms of gender-based violence is highest for those who experience it. Those people live in terror and they fear the consequences of disclosure. Let's think of the most horrific tragedy in Trinidad and Tobago over the last few weeks, which was the assassination of Andrea Lalande and her uncle and the shooting of her father. So again, small arms or arms are also part of that. She was assassinated after reporting her rape to police. So when we talk about ending silence, we also have to ensure those who speak up, who get the courage to speak up, are protected from reprisals. And that will increasingly mean, for many countries, a strong victim and witness support program. There's one in Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know if Aisha is in the room with you all, Tony, but maybe she can share some practice around that. There's also a lot of silence around perpetration and perpetrators. And just the long and short story on that, within UN Women, there is the Partnership for Peace, which is a perpetrator accountability program, which, had been tested out maybe 10, 12 years ago in at least 7 countries. I think it's something that has to be revamped, and I think, Tony, UN Women is doing that and reintroduced. And then there's a silence of communities. So how do we encourage and enable bystanders to be on the front lines of protection? So that's one thing, ending silence. Secondly, analysis. We have to count the cost, the direct and indirect costs, and that's work that UN Women is doing. I've seen that wonderful study from Jamaica. And I think that has to continue. And the analysis has to be making the connections, much like what Tony already said. And we have to start talking in a more political way about the connections between gender-based violence, gender inequality, and social inequalities. And when I say political, I don't mean in a partisan way. When I say political, we have to analyze the power dynamics that flow from inequalities, because these are the dynamics that have to be confronted and interrupted, whether those dynamics are in families, in communities, in the workplace, or nationally. Unequal power dynamics are the really core of a lot of our challenges in the region. And we have to guarantee equality and non-discrimination, and I'm glad that Minister Poyet spoke about that. We can't be calling for gender equality but not being champions of the right to gender identity and the right to your sexual orientation. We have to have clarity on that in the Caribbean. And then planning and execution. We need comprehensive national plans. That's something that's happening, but I think gender-based violence has to be mainstreamed in other policy spaces, much in the way that Tony spoke about. And finally, with my 7 minutes, ending impunity. We have to end impunity. And that starts with a strong justice system and policing system with strong social protection. So I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Clark, and you brought us right back on track, actually. Quickly, ending the silence, and that's the silence where it all presents itself. That's the silence of those who have been victims, survivors, and then to protect them when they actually speak up. It's the silence among perpetrators, and then silence among communities. There was a saying once that it takes a village, and sometimes we wonder, where is that village these days? And so there is the need to end that silence. There's also the need for analysis. I thought also that Tony really brought that home with the data. And if we can get more data, I think you would agree, Dr. Poyet, into the Parliament, into those debates, that perhaps it can begin to turn the tide. There is also the need for the clarity, and we know this all too well in the Caribbean region, the clarity on gender equality and inclusiveness. And then, of course, we know this one all too well, the absolute urgent need to end the impunity that we continue to witness. Thank you so much, Commissioner Clark. We recognize that she may need to leave us as we continue through the balance of the session. For Minister Albert Poyet, as a parliamentarian, you know I'm going to ask you the question, specific for parliamentarians and advocates who are present. it's important that we look at ways in which violence against women and girls can impact, obviously, women's political and public contribution and participation. So could you share with us about this particular aspect or perspective and how in turn it can harm sustainable development if we don't get more women engaged in Parliament?
Okay, the issue of political participation, it is one where we need to disabuse our minds in terms of what we mean by political participation, because most people see political participation as politicians, but we do not see the structure of the society and where the decision makers are and the persons who implement decisions. The most powerful persons in making things happen are never elected to politics. And they are the ones that are heading the different ministries, the different departments, and sometimes politicians are blamed for not doing certain things, not realizing that the administrators are the ones holding it back. And therefore politicians carry the blame. But in order to get persons into the political arena or elected to Parliament and getting more of our women who are gender sensitive at that level, the decision making, we must first assist in helping them overcome the fear of wanting to participate in active politics. It is a deliberate strategy by men to discourage women from participating in active politics. And they keep telling you it is not for you because of stereotype, and they will abuse you and they will curse you. But the man is a human being and the woman is a human being. So why the man can take the curses and the women cannot take the curses? But that is a strategy to keep you away, because they know once you put your heart in the ring, you are likely to win, because it's the women that makes the men win election. You also have the form of intimidation. There is a lot of intimidation around you. Sometimes it comes from women like yourself, tell you you are not fit for that, why are you doing that? You mustn't do that to yourself. And there is also the lack of confidence on the part of women. And there is the fear of taking risk. They see getting to the political arena is high risk. And we said we need both men and we need women at the highest decision-making level. And we want them coming there not because they are a woman or because they are a man. They must also be gender sensitive. And if they are gender sensitive, they will do the right things for both men and women. And I can share one little experience with you. I sat in my cabinet. The Prime Minister will hold me to task saying what I saw in cabinet, but I think it's something that is not breaching the oath of secrecy. It's telling you the truth, and you should know that. And government decided to remove 12.5% VAT on sanitary napkins for women. And I sat in cabinet, and I have not said one word about that. So people thought because I'm a woman there, I would be the one pushing, and Minister Hippolyte, the two of us would be the one lobbying to see if the men, we saw the men there arguing among themselves, deciding they need to do that and they have to do it. The men were pushing the agenda harder than the two of us women. We were just there monitoring what was happening. So we were just hoping that one of them would say no, and then we would jump in. All right? So they actually discussed it, they debated it, and we brought it into Parliament and the women. So we know that one was definitely targeting women. And one of the things we have to work hard is to remove the stereotype. The way we socialize our children in believing that they cannot do certain things If we do that, we will get more women assuming leadership positions in organizations, in institutions, and into the political arena to make that contribution. Because what we call the paternal side of women, it is critical in decision making. The soft side. And I can tell you, Minister Hippolyte and myself, we understand what it is like to be what poverty is like. And there are some homes we have to repair in our constituencies. And if we touch these houses, they will fall. It look like houses that are made of paper. And when you see you get so passionate, so emotional, sometimes you must not be a politician, because a politician must be a humanitarian, and you must be sensitive to the plight of people. And I must say, this government, my government, the government of Sister Hippolyte, is one that is focusing on the plight of women, the plight of the people, and that is why we contribute heavy to education, to health, to the social program, to the housing program, and creating employment that is sustainable. Those issues are not usually high on the agenda, and I believe that's one way of beginning to reduce poverty, by empowering people so that they can take care of themselves, especially the women, because the fathers, a lot of them leave the children for the mothers, and they have to fend for themselves to help for these children. So government is coming in to give some support in that area. So I think if we continue along those paths, and I must share with you, I'm very concerned about the issue of youth, because I am not just Minister for Gender, I'm also Minister for Home Affairs. And I am responsible for the Borderley Correctional Facility, that's the prison. And we have about 576 inmates at the prison. Only 14 are women. And the majority of those that are admitted in recent times, their ages are getting lower and lower, a lot of our young people. So we need to pay attention to that. When I told the Prime Minister I visited the prison, in fact, I'm supposed to go there this week to address another issue. I said I visited the prison 7 times since I was elected. The Prime Minister shared a little joke with me, and he told me, you need to stay there. But one thing I learned when I became Minister of Home Affairs is, for your own safety, you need to care for the inmates. If they realize you care about them, they will protect you out there. And we talk about crime, it's real. So these are things that we need to pay attention to in terms of our young people, and ensuring that we do more prevention rather than trying to cure.
Thank you. Removing stereotype, I think we've all have witnessed that has done more harm than good. Now we need to socialize our young people that women can lead just as men can lead. And it begins from very young with the stereotypes that we've put on our young people. We also need both men and women. I think Dr. Poyet mentioned very strongly around that decision-making table, it's about gender-sensitive and humanitarians. It's not about women versus men, men versus women. All parliamentarians, which I quite like, when she said all parliamentarians must realize that when they get into this arena, they are signing up to the commitment of being a humanitarian. I thought that was quite powerful. And then, of course, empowering our women to overcome the fear and the intimidation tactics and the risks that they perceive that's out there, in order to get our young women involved in the conversation and to be at those tables. To wrap up the discussion, I'll ask Tony if she could share the key ways in which the development community, how this community can support the players, the actors, all of us here who are attending on the next 2 days, in achieving, prioritizing the gender equality issues. How is it that the development community can help us to get this, if you will, up that proverbial agenda, and specifically with the elimination of violence against women? in the respective context?
I think the first thing that's overarching is impactful partnerships. So the development community is not an external community external to the Caribbean. The development community is made up of Caribbean people serving the Caribbean and global people serving the Caribbean and the world. If we are to be successful across these three things, I think we need partnership with Parliament, we need partnership with civil society, as well as the private sector for us to be able to move any needle. And the first thing is moving the needle on investment in data and statistics. Almost 30 years ago, when the Beijing Platform for Action was developed, we did not have prevalence data on what was happening for women and girls. And when you would raise it, it would be an anecdotal story, and therefore the resonance and impact of the issue was difficult to use to really advocate for the kind of legislation and policy required to respond to violence against women and girls. Now we have 5 countries that have that data. We need more. We need it for St. Lucia. We need it for Belize. We need it for all of the countries across the Caribbean so we can see how we're progressing. The other issue is exciting data, and we're small island developing states, so we're not going to be able to invest the kind of money in data collection that some other states may be able to, but we can be innovative. And in Grenada, under the leadership at the time of Halim Brazan, the Statistical Office partnered with UN Women to include 3 questions on the labor force participation survey, just to see what time use was like between women and men. And we found out women were spending 4 hours a day on unpaid care. It's not always duty. The duty is not always one that is not honorable. It is an honorable thing to be able to care for your children, your elderly parents. But they were doing 4 extra hours, and men were just under 2 hours. Just under 2 hours, so almost double the amount of time. That information has been able to inform then how can we support women and men more effectively through legislation and policy making. And without the investment of the Grenadian government in that, we wouldn't have the data. So I think the development community is supporting data and objective data with governments. The other issue is our convening power to bridge. Roberta spoke about partisanship in our region, and it is real. We have civil society organizations saying that the space for them to really advocate is contracting. But we were able, through the Spotlight Initiative, to launch a bicameral women's caucus in Jamaica, where all of the women, turned up together, for the most part, to say we are going to prioritize some issues over partisanship, because everything is political, but not everything has to be partisan. And violence against women and girls was one of those issues, and we called in a Republican and a Democrat from the United States to speak to the Jamaican Women's Bicameral Caucus. And they said there were some issues they just took off the table because they knew they weren't going to agree. Reproductive rights, that wasn't going to happen, between them at least. But they could prioritize violence against women and girls. So the development community creating opportunities for that kind of cross-party collaboration in a real objective space where you get to have honest conversations with one another and respectful, as well as convening for civil society. And civil society meeting parliamentarians, because it doesn't have to be fractious. It can be a very respectful engagement about keeping each other accountable. The other issue that I think is our duty, it's not I think, it is clearly our duty and our mandate, is to support the provision, through the provision of technical advice and innovative programming, governments and civil society in achieving the standards that they have set for themselves. So we've been able to do, Roberta spoke about the Partnership for Peace program, which was really first done in Grenada as well. It's called Man to Man, and it has been going for over 15 years. But one of the things with the innovative programs is if the administration changes, does the program end? Where does it go? Grenada Partnership for Peace is run by an NGO. In other countries in our region, it was run by a government institution, and then the government went out of power, and the program moved as the Ministry of Gender moved, and it did not survive. We also had the great program here that I referenced with regards, when I say here, I mean St. Lucia, the Helen of the West Indies, in terms of the social protection program. And I have to say, as a result of that, the government of St. Lucia then increased their budget allocation for social protection by an unprecedented 29.5%. So you do an innovative program that the government buys into, and then they change their budget to make sure that they can continue the innovative program. And they also increased their gender equality programming by 24%. So Minister, was that you again, Minister Hippolyte, negotiated in cabinet at least around where the budget needs to be, and then going to Parliament and saying this is a budget issue. And Grenada has been the first Caribbean country to have a gender budget. I'm speaking a lot about Grenada. It's not that many other countries have not done incredible work. Trinidad and Tobago has a National Strategic Action Plan for violence against women that will be launched officially soon. Barbados was the first country, thanks to Dame Billy Miller, to have reproductive rights on the agenda. She didn't need bipartisanship to have that happen, and is continuing to do really first mover work when it comes to childhood sponsored in terms of state-funded childcare. There's a lot of good work happening across the region, and of course Belize too has a gender equality caucus. It's not just a women's caucus, it's a gender equality caucus. What we need to do now is make sure that for the structural vulnerabilities that Roberta spoke to, that the development community is working collaboratively with government and civil society for structural solutions. It's not just a little program here and a little program there. We have to have systemic change happen. And that is what we're trying to do through partnerships like the Spotlight Initiative. So I think we all need to, if we're collaborating, we need to know what it is we're collaborating on. What are the principles by which we stand? And we do have a lot of tools that already exist. We don't need to keep recreating new tools. We have tools that exist that we can use, and we have better practices across the Caribbean that we can use for legislative change. Guyana is the only country that has a temporary special measure to promote women's political participation. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, it may be something you want to look at. Because legislation is part of the answer. So is data, so is resources, and this is the last one that's the most important one, communication. Effective communication, because if we're only talking to each other and we haven't changed someone's mind about the role that women and men are supposed to play, we will never get to HFLE actually being updated from 17 years ago, and we will never get to a law being called what it is.
Thank you, Tony. I'm going to now ask Dr. Poyet if she has any last words, any comments on the last question, and then we can close.
I tend to speak from the political eye. What I recall my Prime Minister has always said, all politicians, we have an expiry date. And because we have an expiry date, we do not have all the time in the world to do all the talking. Before we finish talk, we want action. And sometimes even action before we talk. As to whether it's the right action, I don't know, but we have to get things done. So I'm hoping that at the end of this exercise, we will see a lot more action, not just here, but in all the 17 countries present here. And for us to achieve gender equality and to eliminate violence against women and girls, from the policy point of view, I am one that professes to policy development from bottom up. I don't believe any government can just come in and just enact legislations and put in policies and expect miracles to come out. So from the bottom up, we have to involve stakeholders. We have to involve the persons who matter. And therefore, they need to have a say in these policies before you enact them and make it law or rule. And this involvement will cause them to take ownership of the policy. They will embrace it, they will take responsibility for them, and they will drive the process to make it happen. So basically, I'm calling for greater participation of all concerned, and the actions that we will take, we need to focus on what is the output, meaning what do we get now? So when we leave here 2 days, 3 days, we know what came out of this and we know that it achieved its objective. What is the outcome, which will be in the next 6 months? And what will be the impact? And let's look at what happens in the year or two to see if we are seeing changes in that direction. So with that, I think we are on our way, but we have to expedite the process. And if we can use technology, as Tony said, effective communication, we should be able to take the process a lot further and faster. Because COVID did not help the gender agenda. It pushed it back by 20 or so years, and therefore we have to try and pick up speed. And if we can use technology and other resources at our disposal, let us network with each other. Let us not work in silos that everybody is an island on their own, even though the waters divide us, but we have the same problems. And let us support each other so that we can propel this and move it. The will for gender equality is moving too slow. And let us see if we can put some oil and give that a little speed for us to realize some results. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Poyet. But really, how many laws do we not all have on the books and we don't enforce them? Because application, implementation requires the will. Changing hearts, changing minds will not happen overnight. Patriarchy has existed for millennia, but bigotry, discrimination, racism, all of that has existed equally as long, and it's not just going to change overnight. So it's literally changing hearts and minds and making that change one by one, community by community, individuals by individuals. On the matter of fake news and misinformation, if you allow me, that is a real thing. And one of the things I'd like to leave you with, having served now as a parliamentarian, not a politician, but as a parliamentarian and in the position of presiding officer, when you come to that arena, you cannot devoid yourself from the human rights perspective that you signed on to, because each of our countries signed on to them. And we have to, as Dr. Poyet said earlier, hold ourselves to account. We cannot be selective. Human rights are for all of us. All of our citizens must have access, because when one of us do not have access, then we're not doing our jobs as parliamentarians and legislators. And then just let me say, because I think it's such an important point that was raised earlier, the work that is required of all of us as Caribbean nations is not to pit any one of us against each other, man versus woman, woman versus man, and so forth. It's not about that, but it's first to understand what we mean by gender, because I don't think we do. And then it's to do the education first to ourselves, because how can we articulate if we don't understand ourselves? And if I can point to my colleague who I just met from Bahamas, Ms. Brown, she said it very, I think, succinctly this morning when we were chatting. Effective communication, but honest communication is required if we're going to move the needle. And so I do hope you found it as interesting and informative and electric as I did. I was in the hot seat because obviously you're going to talk about that I kept you from your meal, and I don't like that. But I do thank you for your patience. It's always difficult with this type of topic to rein it in, but I do appreciate your indulgence. Letitia Eilish, I believe we can close now. Thank you, Dr. Albert Poyet, as well as Tony Broadbent and Commissioner Clark, who did an excellent job for us in kicking us off on the 2 days. Thank you so much.